y'all, welcome back to Live and Transparent. In this episode, it's our last episode of our series called Breathing to Share Our Story. In this episode, we're kind of wrapping up our stories. And we're, maybe you were able to identify with our stories, either Ashley's or mine, or you're probably not even able to identify with our stories. But one thing is for sure, that God is working through us at all times. We may have different starting points in our journeys, but one thing is for sure is that we will all end up in the victory and redemption of God.
And one of the main things that Melanie's and my story had in common is that we recognize that God is the only answer. Like, if you were able to listen to Melanie's story and my story, that is like the main focus of our story, is that when we recognize God in our situation, our journey completely turns and we are focused on God's presence and God's greatness, And I think that happens a lot, especially when you're in a hard situation, when you truly recognize God's power, because it's like they say that when you are going through those hard valleys and through those dark times, you are able to just truly rely on God, because at that point, it's like the only answer, and it's like, okay, turn to God,
And I guess the question here is, are you going to let Jesus in your situation? Because he's right there. He's waiting for you to proclaim his name, and he's waiting for you to surrender completely to him. Jesus steps into all of our situations. In times of trouble, Jesus is there. In times of desperation, Jesus is there. Jesus is always, always there.
Yeah, and it is true, because you have to completely surrender your problems to God, because God knows your problem. He knows what you're going through. He knows that you're going through a dark time, but it has to come out from you and in your part by surrendering that to him. And within our journeys and our stories, Jesus can be enough. That's like amazing that, you may not have it all together. You may be struggling, but Jesus is enough to hold on to in those times, And this is a common story that's seen in the Bible. And it's basically when Jesus walks on water. Little backstory: the disciples are in a boat. There's a storm, and the disciples are freaking out. They're like, "Oh my gosh, we're gonna drown! We're gonna drown! Like, someone help us!" But the disciples were stuck in a storm. And once Jesus got there, his presence manifested over the situation and the storm calmed down. That's amazing to look at. And that gives me so much peace, because it's like when Jesus comes into our situation, when he comes into our stories, everything changes. At that point, maybe the disciples thought, oh my gosh, we're gonna die in this storm, we're gonna die, this is bad. But then Jesus comes into the situation and everything calms down. It's like, no, Jesus is like, no, relax, relax, dude.
I got you guys.
I got you, you don't have to panic, you don't have to and our destiny changes with Jesus. Instead of having a story of destruction and failure, God gives us a story of redemption. God can change your story. God can change that situation that you are going through into a situation of a blessing, into blessing someone. And what really impacted me of this story, and I hope that it can impact your situation too, is that the storm stopped once Jesus stepped into the boat. So let Jesus step into your situation. Let Jesus step into your story and let him dictate your steps, because once you surrender it to Jesus, and once you proclaim Jesus, there will be an abundance of peace that overflows in your life. And when I do that, I surrender my problems. When I surrender my problems, I feel so much peace right afterwards, because I know that it's not my strength, but I know that it is God's strength, So I think it's always nice to know who you rely on, and we rely on God's power and presence. And there's a process that you go through when you're in those situations, And I think our during our process, we learned a lot. Like during my process, I learned to value what God has given me, and I learned to appreciate God, you know?
And during my process, I learned to appreciate the circumstances that I was faced with. I learned to appreciate if I was, I don't know, facing with a very hard circumstance, I learned to appreciate and find the joy in the circumstance.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something you have to, it's overlooked, you know, like, oh, why would I appreciate going through a hard time? Like, why would I enjoy going through that? But like, it, like I mentioned in my process, was that I didn't see how that was gonna help me. You know, I was like, how is this gonna bring me closer to God? Like, I'm suffering, I'm in pain. Like, how is this going to help me? But in reality, like looking back, I appreciate what I went through, because now my faith is reliant on God, and now I know, like, you know, like, no, it is God, and like I'm able to appreciate everything that God has done in me and in my life.
Yeah, and really nothing gets in the way of God's plans. Understand that you have to understand God's will in your life. And once you do that, everything changes. Like, your whole perspective changes, because the way you view things will just change, because you will see that you live for a bigger purpose. In Ephesians 5:17, it says, understand what the Lord's will is, and his will is to glorify him at all times.
Yeah, and I think we both mentioned this in our story, is that it is God's will at all times, you know, like sometimes I think we're so stubborn, and I know me, like sometimes I'm like, no, I'm so stubborn, you know, and I'm like, no, but I don't want to do that, I don't want to go through that. But in reality, God is like, no, you have to go through that, you know, like it's like not what you want, it's what I'm asking you to do. And sometimes I think that's so hard for us, because like we want to have our life in control, you know, like and like a list and everything like that. And I'm guilty of that. Like I'm like, no, that's not how it was planned, that's not how I planned it. Like no, it's like
we want our plan and not God's plan.
Yeah, and I'm like, no, but it's like I have sort of like a set thing, but God is like, no, you gotta let that go, Ashley. Like, I'm the one in control. I'm the one that's gonna, like, you know, dictate your path, and I know what's good for you, you know. And obviously God knows what's better for us. Like, I could have plans, but God's plans are way greater than mine, and they just serve for a bigger purpose than my plans, you know. So in your trial situations and problems, don't lose sight of what God has for you, you know, and what he is doing through you. Like we mentioned, we can sometimes unappreciate the things that we are going through, and we can sometimes like turn from the things that we are going through, but we cannot lose sight of who is with us. You know, we cannot lose sight that God is by our side. You may not understand why you are going through a certain situation, but you will understand later. And I think that's something that I saw so deeply in my story. I don't know if you saw that in your story, that sometimes you're like, oh man, like, you know, like why? And it's until later, until, like I said, you know, like I write a lot on journals, and I write like my prayers on journals, and that's something that I totally recommend. Like, it is so nice to look at your journals and then going back and then finding those prayers and like, oh my gosh, God answered my prayers, you know. And that's what when I was writing the other podcast about my story, I was flipping through my journals because I was looking for something, right? And then I flipped to this prayer, and I was like, God answered my prayer, you know. So I when I was writing that prayer, I didn't see how God could bring me out of that situation, but rereading those prayers, I was like, oh man, like, you know, God is so good, God got me out of that. And like, later on we will understand why we went through that, and we will understand God's grace and purpose in our lives.
And this kind of brings me to our next point, or more of a question. Are you willing to let go of your plans and let God work in your life? In Matthew 26:39, it says, yet not as I will, but as you will. And sometimes, like Ashley was saying, God will give us what we need instead of what we want. And sometimes the things that we need are probably not the things that we want, or they're they're probably like the way different from what we want.
It's like you don't expect that. It's like, I don't know. Okay, this is kind of like a weird analogy, but it's like you're in a restaurant and then you order like, I don't know, you order some steaks, some ribs and fries, and then they bring you a salad. You're like, what? But I didn't order that. Like, where's my steak? Where's my ribs? Where are my fries? But like, hey, like that's what you got, and that's what like the server was like, no, you need that. To be healthy. But no, that's the same thing with God. Like, yeah, sometimes you don't want to go through those dark valleys. You don't want to go through that, or you're not getting the right answer that you would want to get, but God is like, no, you need this answer, you need that. And I think that's so beautiful when God like has an exact plan for us. He's like, no, I know what's better for you, but like our human nature, just like with our, like, you just don't want to accept it, and it's
our stubbornness gets in the way.
Yeah. So you are in that circumstance and position for a reason and purpose. Maybe you are learning something. Maybe God is using you in your circumstance so someone can get closer to him. He has placed you where you need to be. And I remember when I was going through my recoveries and everything, I was like, oh, well, why am I going through this? Why am I like, I don't understand. But I learned so much. I can say I learned a lot. Like, I feel like, well, obviously we all change, we all change for better. We all change like through periods of time. But I genuinely feel like I learned so much. And I feel like I'm such a different person. Like, if I were like, I guess, yeah, in a way, compare myself from a year from now, how I was before to now, it's like I am so different because I went through so many things that I learned what the true purpose of life is. And the true purpose of life is to glorify and exalt God, and maybe a year ago, maybe I wasn't in this exact position that I am now, but I learned that, yeah, I went through that hard time, but I needed to go through that in order to be like transformed by God's love and transformed by his power, in order to proclaim and exalt his name in a way that I am now. Because, yeah, maybe I still could have exalted God, power and presence if I like without going through any of this, but maybe it wouldn't have been the same. Maybe my relationship with God wouldn't have been as strong as it is now. But I do appreciate everything that I've gone through because it has made me into the person that I am today. It has made me be able to just speak about God's goodness in such a true way because I saw it in my life, And Paul's mindset, Paul is I love reading about Paul. Like, he's really good. And we're gonna be talking about him a lot throughout our next series and throughout our episodes. But Paul's mindset is just amazing to look at because he mentions what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel, and that is like in a way peaceful and so clarifying because everything that we go through serves to bring us closer to God. This is clarifying that everything, in our lives serves to advance the goodness of God, because by our stories and by our testimonies, we are able to like tell people like, no, God has done this in my life. And we have to develop the mindset of our situation speaking about God's goodness and grace. And then I also want to mention something about Paul. If you guys don't really know who Paul is, Paul was a persecutor. He used to kill Christians out. And then there's a complete shift and change in Paul's life that instead of now persecuting Christians, now he is speaking about the gospel. Now he is a preacher.
Churches and spreading God's word.
Yeah, and like you were like, Paul, like the persecutor, he is now preaching and it's just what I just read right now. What has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And Paul's life, like, was like, you could see that God was just going according to God's word. You know, like, you could see that everything that he went through and that he was doing was for God's power and for God's goodness, you know. So I really like to look at Paul's mindset, because that's a mindset that I have to even develop in my life. You know, sometimes like I have to know that whatever I go through, it is like serving for God's purpose, and it is serving for God's goodness, you know?
Yeah, and Paul also, I love the way he always found joy in where he was in his circumstance. He was in prison and he was worshiping and praising God, breaking chains with his praise and his worship. And I think that's something we lack. We sometimes forget to find the joy in what we're going through, that we forget that it's all for God. And it's all about the choice that you make. It's all about the choices that we make. Because Paul could have chosen to assume that God just didn't love him anymore. Because why would God leave Paul in the prison if God loved Paul? And some of us will just walk away from God because he won't give us the answer to the prayer that we want. And sometimes we don't understand God's plan. But sometimes we ask God to take away the things in our lives or in our hearts that are bringing us closer to him and his presence. Like, we might be asking for the wrong things or for the right things with the wrong intentions.
Yeah. No, that's true. Because even for me, like, sometimes I'm like, oh, God, take this away. And, like, I'm like, oh, why aren't you taking it away? But it's like I just read, like, it's serving to advance the gospel, you know? Like, sometimes, like, oh, well, I don't want to go through that. Well, I don't want that. Like, why don't you take it away? But in a way, we're kind of like, we can't, like, truly see God's power and purpose behind that. You know, there is always, like we've been mentioning through all these series, is like, there is always a purpose. There's always a reason why you are passing through that, you know. And not only that, but, like, you truly have to come to an understanding that God is right there with you. You know, God will never leave you. And I hope that, like, you can take that to heart, you know, like, take it to heart. Like, yeah, like, through that hardness and that hardship, God is there, you know. Like, God was there with Paul. Like, yeah, Paul was in prison, but like Melanie just said, Paul rejoiced, you know. He rejoiced not because, I mean, you're not going to rejoice, like, people won't be like, well, why am I going to rejoice if I'm in prison? No, he rejoiced because he knew who was with him, and he rejoiced because he knew that God it wasn't going to leave him, you know. And even though Paul was in prison, like, he would write a bunch of letters. You know, that's one thing about Paul. He would always write letters to the church, like, hey, guys, remember to follow God. Hey, guys. Like,
he would write letters of freedom while being in prison.
Yeah, and, like, you're like, that's crazy. Like, Paul is in prison. Paul is chained. Paul is, like, but he's writing letters of freedom. Like, what? But that's the mindset that we have to develop in our lives. It's like, yes, like, maybe I am, like, for my story that I mentioned, yeah, I was in my bed, couldn't move, but, like, you know, I would grab my Bible and I would read, and I would be like, okay, I am free, I am healed, you know. Like, you gotta proclaim those words into your life, and you gotta, like, proclaim God's goodness. And in a way, it's like, how do you say, well, kind of like, speaking the truth, and, like, kind of like how would you say, I can't find the word right now, but it's like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the word. Okay, we'll just work with it. But it's like speaking and knowing that God is going to do it, you know. Like, Paul knew that God, and there's this verse that we were reading that Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And, like, oh,
we were in Starbucks and we were like,
no, but it was so good. Like, Paul is like, that's the mindset that we have to develop, you know, that whatever we are going through is a gain for Christ, because God will use any aspect of our life. You know, sometimes I think we try to hide those dark places and those dark, like, I guess, points of our story because we're ashamed of it, you know, or we're like, well, no, I don't think God can use me, or I don't think God has a story for me. But we just told you that Paul was a persecutor. Now he's a preacher. Like God can do anything through anyone. You know, maybe sometimes you even look at like family members or friends are like, how is God gonna change this one?
I know.
Well, God can do it. Like, God can use that person's story. Like, yeah, maybe your past isn't the best, you know, maybe you went through a lot of things, but God can turn your past into like a redemption story. Like we were just saying about the disciples, like God can, like, instead of having a story of destruction and failure, God can change your story into a story of redemption and freedom through his grace, you know. And like Melanie said, that hard situation is not the end of you, you know. And sometimes I think like you're like, oh man, this is it. Like we said, Paul had so many reasons to give up, but he didn't.
He kept going.
He kept going because I don't think I wrote this verse down, but it's like, keep going because there is like, at the end you will be rewarded the reward of eternity. You know, and Paul clearly knew that. Paul clearly knew that he had to hold on to God's word. He had to hold on to his story, and he had to hold on to God's grace because he knew that there was going to be victory at the end. You know, like he knew who holded him. He knew that God has the ability and capability to turn your story completely around.
And God has so much more for you. God has so much more for us and your story and your testimony. And Jesus made us for more. He designed us a story, and we have to be confident that we will see God's goodness in our life and in our testimonies. There are even bigger how do I say, like,
there's like an even bigger story.
Yeah, there's an even bigger story in our lives, and that's the story that God has allowed us to be part of by giving us the stories that glorify and exalt him.
Yeah, you know, like our stories are significant. You know, they contribute to God's goodness and God's power, but the story above ours is Jesus. You know, that's the redemption story of all time. Like Jesus raising from the dead, like that is the comeback of all times, you know. And like yes, our stories, which I think is amazing that God has allowed us to contribute and be part of serving the gospel and of spreading the gospel, because he has given us stories that in which we are able to exalt him and glorify him. And I just think that it's amazing how we each uniquely have a story. Like we've been emphasizing, like we all have different stories, but we all end with a redemption of God and glorifying God, because like at the end it'll all come together for a purpose, and that is God's purpose, you know.
And we have to remember that our story revolves around God. And when people see our story, when they hear our story, they have to see God in us. When we talk about our story, we have to talk about the grace and goodness of God. We have to be a reflection of God in our lives.
I was about to say that because we've been in church, we've been like through the Bible studies, we've been looking about like how we have to reflect God, how we have to reflect Jesus, you know. And I was like, okay, well, how can I reflect Jesus? You know, like what can I do to reflect Jesus? And then I've been reading Galatians, Ephesians, and James, you know, I've really been focusing on the letters that Paul has written, and in these books he emphasizes serve. You know, serve wholeheartedly, serve by making the gospel known, serve by doing the will of God, you know. And it also says serve wholeheartedly. And like I'm like, okay, well, in a way I'm still questioning, okay, well, like, how am I gonna serve? You know, like, how, like, yeah, like, I help people. Like, we actually just finished, okay, this is a little, like, in parentheses, parentheses. We were parking at Albertsons because we went to go get sushi, but I saw, while I was trying to park, I saw these ladies, right? Like, they were older already. And I was like, oh, look, Melanie, poor ladies, right? And then they had, like, a whole cart full of groceries. And then I was like, oh, I feel like I should help them. And I was like, oh, my heart, you know, like, and then I was going to walk away. Don't do that. And then I was like, no, Melanie, let's go help. Let's help them. And I was like, oh, can we help you put your groceries in your trunk? I'm like, yes, thank you so much. You know, that instantly, like, made us like, oh, okay, like.
Yeah, it kind of, like, made us feel
good, you know, because it's something so, I guess it could be insignificant for us,
but not for them.
Because they're gonna remember, oh, these two young ladies, these two beautiful young ladies helped us put groceries in our trunk, you know. But okay, so continuing, closing parentheses, and moving on. But it's like, okay, like, yeah, I can serve in those ways, but like, how I want to serve in a bigger purpose, you know. And by me serving, it's by me sharing my story, you know. And honestly, when I had told Melanie this idea, like, oh, let's share our stories, you know, like, I was like, oh no, I don't want to do that. Like, part of me knew. And no, I mean, I know that I have to share my story, but the other part of me was like, oh, actually, but that's so, like, in a way, I was like, that's embarrassing. No, what are people gonna think of me? No, like, I don't want to do it, but I'm like, no, but I have to do it. And it was kind of like, in a way, like, not really contradicting myself, but I was like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And, but the thing is, like, no, you have to be willing to share your story, you know, like, you that's in a way that you can serve and be like Jesus is, like, sharing your story and sharing those vulnerable parts, because I think we both shared, like, a vulnerable part of our lives, you know. Like, if it were for me, I would have never done it. I would have been like, no. Like, honestly, like I said, like, I've changed so much from a year from then to now, because I don't think I would have done it a year ago. I would be like, nope. Like,
we were talking about this right now when we were walking. I was like, me from the past, like, me from a year ago, I was like, I would be like, dang, like, what is she doing? Like, oh my god.
Yeah, like, I don't think I would have ever seen myself doing this like a year ago. No. But now here we are, you know, like, now here we're like proclaiming God's goodness, and we're sharing our stories, and we're making the gospel known, which is one of our main goals, like, not just through this series of Breathing to Share My Story, but throughout all the other series that we have upcoming, is that we will truly want to focus on making the gospel known, you know. And I also kind of remembered right now how we've been talking about Moses, you know, and how it's like, if your presence doesn't go before me, then I don't want to move and I don't want to go forth. And actually, that's a prayer that I recently prayed, is like, you know, God, like take me where it is that I need to go. Like, do your will, you know. Like, that's a prayer that I often pray, is like, God, do your will in my life. Like I want to serve, like, wholeheartedly. Like, I want you to use me. And in a way, that's how your stories develop. Your stories develop by surrendering all to God, you know, like we've been saying, like, and I encourage you to pray this prayer of Moses too, the prayer that Moses prayed, like, God, if your presence doesn't take me there, then I don't want to move, you know. And that's a prayer that you have to pray through your process, you know, and that will really, like, help, I guess, know your story, because I think sometimes you don't recognize.
Well, that happened to me. I didn't even know if I had a story. It was like, I didn't go through, I don't know, like Ashley did. I didn't go through surgeries. I didn't almost die. I was like, nothing really happened in my life significantly enough for me to call it like a testimony. But really, my whole life was a testimony. My whole life was my story.
Yeah, and that's true, you know, like, sometimes you're like, oh, I live such a boring life. No, you don't. Like, often our pastor says this a lot. You don't know what Jesus just saved you from.
I know.
You know, like you could have been driving and like you almost got in a crash, but God saved you from that. You know, like every single aspect of your life is your story, you know, and you just have to like appreciate and truly recognize that, and you even have to like ask God to open your eyes in order to recognize your story, because sometimes I think like we mentioned, like our mindsets and our minds and our eyes can close to God's grace and power in our lives, that it causes you not to recognize your story. But you have to pray that prayer too, you know, and like I've been mentioning, prayer, that is so important in your life in order to advance and in order to see the story that is being developed within you. Because even right now, as we're speaking, a story is still developing within us. Like, yeah, we shared a testimony, and maybe you're like, oh, well, I only have one testimony. Share that one testimony, you know, share that one story that you have, and God will continue to develop stories within your life as you go according to his will and as you go according to the gospel. You know, God will he will make himself known more and more in your life. You just have to be willing to listen to his will and do what like the Bible tells us to do, you know. And we truly hope that this series of Breathing to Share My Story allows you to recognize your story. You know, like, don't unappreciate the story that God has for you. And kind of, you know, when I guess when I was little, they would always be like, oh, who has a petition? And then be like, oh, you know, like, and I would always be like, oh, that petition is so whatever. Like, why are they praying for that? You know, but now I'm like, no, like, hold on to prayer. Pray about everything. Like, maybe you're like, oh, well, you know, my situation isn't as big. No, like, pray for that. Like, pray for every single thing, because like we've been saying, every single thing serves for God, and every single thing will bring you closer to God. You may not see it now. Maybe it takes you a year to recognize what God has done in your life. Maybe it takes you 2 years, you know, like, but you have to recognize God. And we also hope that by us sharing our stories, that in a way you gain confidence to share your story. You know, like, I know it was hard for me, and I told Melanie, I was like, oh my gosh. And Melanie was like, no, you got it. You know, when she was sharing her story, she was like, oh, I know, Ashley. But I was like, no, you got it. You know, like be, I guess, courageous enough and boldly share what God has done in your life.
Because by recognizing our stories, it's impacting us, but it's impacting everyone else around us. And maybe people can even experience God through our stories.
Yeah, they can see the reflection of Jesus, like we just mentioned, like through your story. Like we've mentioned, I think it was like one of the first episodes, like, people cannot see your story if you don't share it, you know. A lot of people are like, what? Oh my gosh, Ashley, like, Melanie, I didn't know you went through all of that. But like, it's like, no, yeah, I did go through all of that, and Jesus like got me through all of that, you know. And we just truly want to encourage you and remind you to share your story while you still have the opportunity to do so, you know, because God right now has given us the privilege for me and Melanie to have I guess sort of a platform to share our story and speak about God. And maybe you're like, oh, well, I don't have a platform to do that. Or yeah, but like, you can share your story starting with your friends, starting with your family, you know. It all starts somewhere, but you just have to find that opportunity, and every opportunity that you have to share and speak about God's goodness, do it, you know. Because sometimes like how we just mentioned about the grocery like helping the older ladies, like, maybe we wouldn't have done it and we would have missed an opportunity there. You know, and when you miss opportunities to talk about God, I don't know if it happens to you or if it happens to you guys, I feel bad. I'm like, oh, I didn't do what God wanted me to do, you know. And I'm like, ah, and then I'm like, okay, God, give me another chance, like, allow me to like have that opportunity again. And sometimes you don't get those opportunities to share your story.
A long time ago, I don't think you went, we went to this youth event at this other church. And during the youth event, this guy, he was praying for me, and he told me, he was like, you need to do this, and you need to tell this person this and that person that. And I was like, sure. I was like, I'm not gonna tell them, that's so embarrassing. I was like, cringe, no.
Like, no.
Yeah, but and then I didn't end up doing it, and I had told my mom about it. I was like, oh, like, this dude told me to tell this to that person. And then my mom was like, well, are you gonna do it? And I was like, no. I was like, yeah, I'll do it later. But I never did it. And I kept thinking about it, and I was like, I should have done it, and I should have done it. And because I didn't do it, something like not good happened because I didn't do it. And my mom kept telling me, she was like, yes, you should have done it. You should have told them.
If you would have done it, this would have happened.
And I was stressing. I was like, oh my God. And I remember crying. I was like, I should have done it. Like, why didn't I do it? I could have stopped whatever happened from happening if I would have just been like
able to like in a way share.
I was like, I regretted it so much. So now every time someone tells me, or sometimes I even feel like telling people, like, you know what, like, I don't know, like, God loves you or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. Even something as simple as that, like, okay, maybe you're in a way you kind of sort of have to develop that, like, oh, but I don't want to share my story yet. Like, I barely even know this girl. Like, hey, like, God loves you. Hey, you got this, you know? Like, hey, like, you know, God has a great purpose for your life. Even those simple words can impact someone's life, and you cannot miss the opportunity to do so. So, like, just, like, truly, like, every time you have the opportunity, like, do it. Like,
I've said it as my goal. I was like, my goal is to talk to more people about God. So now every time I go to work, I'll be like, hi, God bless you, God bless you.
Yeah, and that's something like we said, something that may seem insignificant to us, but in reality it helps other people, and it opens the way for God in their lives, you know. So that is the whole main purpose of all this series of Breathing to Share My Story, is to proclaim God's goodness through our story and be a reflection of Jesus, you know. So that was the end of this series.
That's crazy.
And yeah, it went by fast, actually. So now we are preparing an even better series, and we got a microphone, as you guys can probably tell.
Can you guys hear us?
But yeah, slowly we're getting better. Because it's a learning experience for us, you know, like, we've never done this.
It is kind of hard.
Yeah, but like, we're just trusting in God's word, and we know that He's the one that's gonna provide, you know. And like we mentioned in one of the very first episodes, it's like we're just doing what God has asked us to do, and God will do the rest. God will be the one that transforms hearts and lives. We're just like Paul, speaking out. But I kind of gave a little hint of what our next series is gonna be about. We won't mention it.
Whoever gets it will get a chocolate.
Whoever gets it, God will bless you.
Amen.
But yeah, I shared it's a one word that I shared, and we will not share what this next series is about until next week. So make sure to stay tuned, because we have a lot planned, and we're so excited to continue to share God's word. So yes, thank you so much for watching, and God bless you.